The United States Marine Corps has a long and proud tradition of being America's force in readiness. First to fight is a motto of the Marines, who are used to establish a beachhead or seize a port, clearing the way for other U.S. forces to enter a combat area. In 1965, the U.S. forces closest to Vietnam were Marine units already embarked on ships of the U.S. 7th Fleet. Given their traditional mission and this proximity to Vietnam, the Marines were called upon to be the first U.S. ground forces deployed in South Vietnam. This is their story. In 1964, the U.S. had over 16,000 advisors in Vietnam, as well as military and other units providing air, helicopter, and logistics support to the South Vietnamese Army. But the situation within South Vietnam had deteriorated to the point that the safety of the advisors and aviation units could no longer be guaranteed. Using a series of deadly attacks on U.S. forces as an excuse, President Johnson ordered U.S. ground forces into the country. On the 8th of March, 1965, the Leathernecks of the 9th Marine Expeditionary Brigade splashed ashore near Da Nang.
Outside of Da Nang, it was just hot, and the insects, everything was just got to you right away, and it was like, I don't think I really want to make it. If I'm going to go, let me go now. Don't let me go through 10, 11 months of this.
The brigade was to be only temporarily stationed ashore, just until the situation within the country could be stabilized and the security mission returned to the Vietnamese. The Marines would fight and die for almost 7 years in what was ultimately a wasted effort to save the government of South Vietnam. The Marines were organized to be self-sufficient, and so they brought not only infantry, armor, and artillery, they also brought Marine aviation units. In order to sustain operations in Vietnam for any sort of extended period, the Marines had to build many large support facilities. Base camps, storage dumps, and airstrips sprang up almost overnight, as Marine engineers and Seabees worked around the clock. As the Marine presence in the country grew, the network of bases spread out across areas which had been almost completely under the enemy's control. The guerrillas had been very successful in the northern provinces of South Vietnam and were easily supported by infiltration through the Demilitarized Zone, or DMZ. The Marines' first objective was to defend the airfield at Da Nang, which was under fire from enemy positions just south of the runway. In addition, they were soon ordered to protect the whole northern portion of South Vietnam and stop enemy movement through the DMZ. Sustained combat operations over areas far from the coast is not the traditional role of the Marine Corps.
They'll be called upon to move further in from the coast, away from their traditional fire support. They'll be called upon to stay in the country longer for a sustained period of time. And these things will call for some reorganization and re-equipping of the Marines in order to allow them to be able to perform these missions effectively that they're being asked to do.
The Marines were equal to the challenge as they adapted their tactics and overcame the conditions they encountered. Marine units went about the job of controlling the huge area of operations they were initially assigned. As the effort to halt the infiltration of supplies through the DMZ became more systematic, the Marines constructed a series of fire bases in the inhospitable countryside along the imaginary dividing line between North and South Vietnam.
We were trucked up to this place called A3. It was supposed to be part of McNamara's Wall. So we went up there, the battalion did, and we were kind of the protection for the Army. They came in to build these bunkers and that for us. We were the ones that filled all the sandbags and all that while they used their bulldozers and that. Muddiest place ever. I thought Oregon had mud. No, Vietnam's got mud.
From these bases, known derisively as the McNamara Line, patrols would fan out across the rugged terrain, searching for the enemy.
Some of it was triple canopy jungle, some of it was destroyed jungle, some of it was elephant grass kinds of terrain, but all hilly.
The McNamara Line was designed to block the route south through the DMZ. The positions were within range of North Vietnamese artillery above the DMZ. The Marines, whose doctrine emphasized offensive combat above defensive fortifications, were often pounded unmercifully.
It was all small unit stuff, squad size, platoon size, firefights that were invariably over within 2 or 3 minutes. I wasn't involved in any of the big battles of the war, but the ones I was in were often deadly in a very short period of time, depending on whether we were on the receiving or the giving end of the action.
We're in the comm bunker. I was on one of the radios, radio watch, and the CO and the XO, that's where they stayed in there. We had another rocket attack, and a piece of shrapnel came through the bunker, went through the back of the XO's head, and stuck in the bunker. We carried him out. He was still alive, but he had a gaping wound in the back of his head. We got him on a chopper, and it wasn't until maybe 8-9 months ago that I found out that he died. I think it was in a 10-day period. We took over 660 rounds at a place called A3. The incoming was so bad, and I was so scared because there was no place to hide.
At the same time they were being regularly shelled, the positions had to be laced together by constant patrolling. While generally effective at halting the enemy's movement, these patrols were very dangerous and could cause other kinds of anguish for the Marines on the DMZ.
I'd hurt my back, pulled a muscle, pinched a nerve or something. And I couldn't go out on patrol. So the corporal, he had to go in my place, and they were coming back that morning, and he wasn't maybe 20 yards from our bunker when we got a rocket attack. And a rocket landed real close to him, and it shrapnel all up in the side of his body. And that was supposed to have been me. I was supposed to have gone.
While the Marines watching the DMZ coped with the conditions and strains of combat, other Leathernecks were taking the fight to the enemy in a series of search and destroy missions along the heavily populated northern coast of South Vietnam. Beginning in late August 1965, U.S. Marines undertook a series of missions to secure the northern coastal area. The first of these was Operation Starlight against the Viet Cong 1st Regiment in the coastal area near Chu Lai. This operation succeeded in trapping a large enemy force using a combination of amphibious and heliborne attacks. As dawn broke, U.S. Marines prepared for the amphibious portion of the operation. While naval gunfire struck the shoreline, Marines and landing craft, as well as huge 40-ton armored amphibious tractors, or Amtraks, moved toward the beach in lines. As they arrived on the sandy shore, the tractors came to a stop and disgorged their cargoes of Marines. Against little opposition, the infantry moved inland, followed by Ontos armored vehicles, and then the infantry carriers. As this conventional attack progressed inland, other Marines hurried to load on H-34 Sikorsky helicopters at an improvised helicopter pad near Chu Lai. Heavily laden with assault troops, the helicopters lifted off and headed inland. Offshore, other Marines moved across the deck of the helicopter carrier USS Iwo Jima and boarded other H-34 helicopters. Flying above the range of enemy light machine guns, the passengers were lost in their thoughts.
I'm thinking, when I get off here, where is the first place I can hide? Where's the nearest hole? Where's the nearest place to duck?
As the descent to the landing zone, or LZ, began, the crew watched for any sign of the enemy. The Marines hurried off the helicopters and moved to constitute a blocking force across the routes of any enemy troops fleeing from the amphibious landing. The helicopter-landed force instead ran into a day of heavy fighting, and only reinforcements from the reserve offshore allowed them to carry out their mission the next day. Operations such as this were often a Marine's first taste of battle. The experience of shooting and being shot at for the first time was one the Marines would never forget.
You're not even focused on the sound, it's the air. It's the bullet cutting through the air. After that, you hear the cracking, the gunfire, and that you almost aren't focused on that. Other than you're scrambling, and you don't know which way to go to get down, and you don't know which way to get behind the tree. It's like, first time it's like, well, where did it come from? You never hear the one that hits you.
While the blocking forces fought to stop any enemy withdrawal, the amphibious forces continued to push inland.
Well, Operation Starlight, this first Marine major operation in Vietnam, was very successful, and after 3 days of fighting, the enemy forces in the area of the operation are just decimated. They've been unable to stand up to American firepower, and they're pushed into the sea or killed.
Usually, these operations met little direct resistance. Instead, they often encountered booby traps.
Sometimes I think about the attrition numbers of men who are ready to lose because of booby traps. It took you a while to learn the terrain. You stay flat on the trail, never go off the trail on a patrol. They would never booby trap a trail. They'll booby trap on the edge of it, but never in the middle of the trail. Always stay on the trail. And you'd get in areas and you'd see a sign, and I could read some Vietnamese because I'd been to language school, but on the other side there'd be the danger sign and telling you that there's a bomb ahead. So you knew that you just went through one, but it was for the people coming down the other side of the trail.
Wires meant that someone had waited for the Marines. Often this would lead to the small kinds of deadly actions that were typical of Vietnam.
I was leading the company patrol. We came down to this river called the Ben Hai River. And we had a man with us who was an NVA soldier, and he'd switch sides. And there was these 2 big mats sitting there and some wires running down to the river. And he went over to this mats, and he started talking in Vietnamese, and to interpret it was there's some bad bombs here. What they wanted to do was kill us all, get as many of us up around here and set it off. Well, he pulled the mats off and then ran down and cut the wires, and there was 2 500-pound bombs there that were dropped and then didn't detonate, so they rigged them up to blow us up with them.
Generally, the booby traps weren't so elaborate. Sharpened stakes might wait in a concealed pit, or a buried box with nails driven into the hinged lid would lay poised to snap on an unprotected leg. Mines of all kinds were buried off the trails and in the roads. A mace was a weighted-down can with bamboo stakes driven through it. It would wait suspended from the trees for an unsuspecting patrol.
The booby traps encountered by American forces in Vietnam really ran the whole gamut of things. You found 500-pound bombs that hadn't exploded rigged with command detonation devices. A variety of mines, Soviet and U.S. captured mines. Toe poppers, shells that were rigged to explode and wound the guy in the foot. And if they had no munitions or explosives, then the Viet Cong would use whatever they did have available in the area. They'd create these crude bamboo spear throwers, or they'd use crossbows rigged to a tripwire. They might have a pendulum with bamboo spikes that would swing down on a trail. Whatever they had available is what they used. And if they were forced out of a village or out of an area, then they'd booby trap the common household items or things in the village. So it made it more difficult for American forces to move through and check those villages out.
Caution and minesweeping was a must as units moved anywhere inland. The constant strain of vigilance and the seemingly inevitable casualties weighed heavily on the Marines' minds.
The casualties that I saw, or the casualties that I treated, that's got to be multiplied so many times over. And you work either with me it was either in a surgery ward or in ICU. You work 14 hours and you sleep for 12, and then you're off, maybe off a day every so often, and there's nothing to do but just be angry about how am I going to have to deal with this, and everybody's seriously injured, everybody's seriously wounded, the war that I'm seeing. So it's like carnage. And it's like you're treating a car accident, or you're treating this, but you're treating it all the time.
In the face of these casualties, Marines did whatever possible to increase their own chances of survival.
I'd go through phases where I'd be more or less uncautious, and other times where I'd be downright paranoid. And I think at this period I wouldn't sleep in the bunker. I was sleeping behind the bunker, because if they hit the bunker with a rocket-propelled grenade, RPG, it would explode inside, and you didn't want to be there. So I'd sleep outside the bunker behind it and keep my boots on. And there was that level of concern, especially when you're about ready to go home. You do everything you can to maximize your chances. And you kind of learn that you hear this philosophy from a lot of guys, well, when your time's up, your time's up. But it starts to seem like, well, those are the guys that, sure enough, their time is up.
One of the proudest traditions of the Marine Corps is to leave no Marine, dead or wounded, on the battlefield. And in Vietnam, this was exploited by the enemy.
In the end, the NVA would lay them out there and hope we'd come in and try, have a trap set up for us. But you're always trying to get your dead, wounded out no matter what. And sometimes it costs lives, but that's just, you're not going to be left behind if possible.
Casualties or no, an operation had to go forward. As the Marines moved inland, they began to encounter Vietnamese villages. These villages had to be searched and cleared of the enemy. The walls of huts were probed, tunnels uncovered and checked. In the fortified villages along the coast, extensive tunnels, trenches, and bunkers were common. If the troops found tunnels, they had to be searched and then the entrances sealed with explosives. Soon, nearly any Vietnamese village would have a bomb shelter for each family, and sometimes for their animals as well. Each had to be looked into. Any civilians still in the village were rounded up. Papers were checked and the villagers questioned.
Once a village was searched and the people were checked, what happened next was really dependent on what the American policy was at that particular time in the war, whatever year it might be, or the area of operations that the village was located in. If the village was in a free fire zone, for instance, the policy was, generally speaking, that the civilian population would be evacuated to a resettlement camp, and likely Viet Cong suspects would be turned over to the ARVN for questioning or detention, whichever was most appropriate. And the village itself would be destroyed, the idea being that we needed to remove the civilians from the area and from the influence of the Viet Cong. On the other hand, if it was a no-fire zone or at times during the war, the American unit would simply move on and leave the village as it was and continue on with their operation, whatever that might be.
As evening approached, the Marine units moved into their night defensive positions. Sunset over the coast was beautiful, a beauty that belied the dangers of the coming darkness.
Me and another guy were put on lines for that night. He was an MP, and he was also brand new, hadn't been in the country very long. It was probably about midnight or 2 o'clock, and I woke him up, and I went back and sat in a hole And the next thing, all hell broke loose. Green tracers were going right over his head. Charlie Company was down in front of us, probably 150 yards, 200 yards. Flares were going off. We had incoming all around us. I had never seen an incoming mortar or a flare or knew what it was or anything, what it meant. And when the flares were going up, you could see the gooks coming up the hill at us. They'd overrun Charlie Company. They were coming right up the hill at us. And then I could hear them in between the flares. Needless to say, I've never been so scared in my life. I don't think people know what the meaning of fear is until they've actually been in a situation like that. We ended up, I think, with 23 killed. I don't know how many wounded. But that was my first night in Vietnam.
The Marines who fought in Vietnam had a huge advantage in technology and firepower over their enemy. Doctrine called for the support of tanks and aircraft to be available when possible to the smallest unit in contact. Marine jets flown from the bases at Chu Lai and Da Nang could be scrambled quickly or be already in the air, waiting for a call from the forward units.
We called them in several times. I got to see them come in. We'd pull back from a tree line. They would come in, down the tree line, drop their napalm, and hit the afterburners.
The effectiveness of the close air support was very good, and it was mostly Marine aircraft that we were getting. And at night, you'd see a lot of they were called Snoopies, the gunships that would come in and give a light show.
Airstrikes could be supplemented or replaced by Marine artillery. Forward observers moved with the ground units or flew in light observation planes overhead. These men could control an awesome array of firepower from light mortars to artillery and naval gunfire. In addition, there were Marine helicopter gunships, propeller-driven close support aircraft, and the most modern jet fighters, on call when needed. All were dedicated to supporting the grunt, the Marine infantrymen on the ground. Because of their mission of landing on hostile beaches, the Marines are taught to be self-sufficient. Every Marine, every cook, clerk, and musician is trained to be a rifleman. When the Marines landed in Vietnam, they brought their M14 30-caliber rifles. The weapon was large and heavy, and it was generally acknowledged that it was overpowerful for the ranges most infantrymen fought at. By 1967, American forces in country had received the new M16 assault rifle. This lightweight weapon had great advantages in the heat and terrain of Southeast Asia. The bullet it fired had been engineered to tumble when it hit, creating devastating wounds.
Tumble action, that bullet was fantastic. It had great killing power, and it did when it worked. You had to carry a whole bunch of pour cleaner and oil on it all the time and keep that weapon clean. If that weapon got the least bit of dirt in it, it malfunctioned.
With those infantrymen and sharing the deprivations of field duty were the Marine tankers. They rode their armored machines through the inhospitable countryside, working closely with the grunts. The two formed a team for mutual protection. The armor could give the infantry additional firepower, while the infantry could assist the tanks in finding the enemy and help protect them from enemy infantry who would sometimes attempt to swarm over them with grenades and explosive charges.
Well, normally The tanks you cannot operate by themselves because you're blind. So the infantry, or the enemy, their infantry can take you out with rocket launchers and things like that. So you always work in very close conjunction with the infantry. They had to be within 100 yards or so of the tank just to give the tank itself protection because of all the blind spots in the tank. And they'd have a tank infantry phone in the back of the tank. The infantry could go up and open it up, take it out and talk to the tank crew. And if they seen a target that, like a machine gun or something like that, was giving them a lot of heavy fire that the tank didn't see, they could get on the telephone and talk to them and tell them exactly where it was at and everything like that for them to shoot it and take it out.
Once the enemy positions were pointed out to them, the firepower of the supporting tanks could be used to overcome any dug-in enemy that held up the Marines' advance. The enemy soon learned to avoid that formidable combination.
I kept moving the tanks around at all times. Every night I tried to have them in a different location, in a different place, because I found that the VC planned their attacks very thoroughly and ran them. And they would not run an attack where there was a tank. So every night I put tanks in different locations, at a bridge where they was guarding, or a particular outpost, or I kept moving those tanks around. So I was successful there, and I went wherever the colonel needed tank support.
However, once the Marines began using tanks in Vietnam, it did not take the enemy long to counter by sending anti-tank weapons south. To the tankers, the RPGs, or rocket-propelled grenades, seemed to be everywhere.
When we first went to Vietnam, they wasn't that bad, because unless they hit the tank at a good angle, they ricocheted. But the RPG-7s that we started running into at the last, they didn't ricochet. And that sucker ain't seen what it won't put a hole in.
The United States placed restrictions on this firepower, in theory, to limit the damage caused to South Vietnamese civilians. As a result, this was a war that U.S. forces had to fight with rules of engagement that often seemed to curb their ability to take action. Some of these restrictions seemed to make it far more difficult to win the war the Marines were being asked to fight.
Now, at one time we could go out and fire at anybody, then they took that right away from us. It came from way up. And we had to make sure that that was the enemy before we fired upon them. Otherwise, we had to take fire before we would return fire.
Armor and overwhelming firepower notwithstanding, U.S. operations eventually came down to careful searches of an entire area on foot. Individual squads and platoons fanned out as they probed coastal caves and searched dense jungles. At times, due to this dense jungle terrain, helicopters weren't able to land. It was then that Marine patrols had to be inserted into an area by innovative means such as ropes or rope ladders. Marines tried to be constantly on the alert. In the early years of the war, most contacts were initiated by the enemy. Ambushes were common.
There were 9 of us all together on the ambush. All of a sudden, we just got hit with satchel charges. And all I remember is people screaming and yelling, and we're trying to return fire. First guy I got to, he was dead. And I remember I'm trying to get an airway down his throat, and I realized he's just dead. The radio man, he'd had been a guy I'd been really close with, and I got to him, and he was alive, but he'd lost one of his legs right at the knee. The other one, it was higher, and I couldn't get it. I remember scrambled to try and get a tourniquet on it, and I couldn't. It kept slipping. The choppers came, and we got out, and I didn't realize I'd been popped pretty good too, but I didn't even realize it. Then the medevac came out. like I say, there were 9 of us, and 4 died, and everybody else was wounded. I think I probably got off the easiest. And I don't know. I was just very, very lucky.
These traumatic experiences created the need for downtime when the Marines could ease the fear and tension of living in the field. In Vietnam, many base camps were exceptionally well provided. There were stores with American goods, and at some of the bases, military auxiliary radio stations, or MARS stations, had been set up where the Americans could call home.
I remember the first time I went to a MARS station, and the MARS station was a bunch of ham radio operators. There was a network, and you could actually go and call to the United States. So I got to call and talk to my wife. And I'd been there, I don't know, 4 or 5 months at that point. And I went and I called her, and I think the time difference was, 12, 14 hours, and it was like 2 in the morning when I called her back in the States. And I'd had this old record player, but it had a speaker on it, so I'd wired it up in our tent so the guys could hear me talking to my wife. And all she could do was cry. Is that really you? Is that really you?
With all these official and approved recreation facilities available, the Marines, like all American personnel, were also quick to take advantage of any unexpected opportunity.
I was on a switchboard, and the motor pool had got in 2 pallets of beer. Well, I hurriedly got very creative and went to the motor pool, boarded one of their half-ton trucks, went over to the flight line and said, "Yeah, I'm here to pick up the beer," and picked up a pallet of beer.
However, the period of rest would inevitably end. The Marines would find themselves loaded up and sent out to the field again in a constant effort to find and defeat the enemy. In addition to the problem of finding and defeating the enemy, the Marines, like the rest of the U.S. forces in Vietnam, faced a far more difficult problem. Could the areas seized from the enemy be truly pacified?
And we had a lot of people, especially at the higher level, that had no understanding about winning the hearts and souls of the people on the ground. They were interested in body count, but they weren't interested in getting to the people, except for the Marine Corps that had their platoons and their squads that go out into a village and pacify the village and help the villagers, and pretty soon they started getting a lot of intelligence in. But when you go out and you just blast away, the people aren't going to support you.
The Marines in the 1st Corps area adopted a unique program known as the Civil Action Program, or CAP, under which Marine and South Vietnamese units were assigned to secure villages.
You go into a ville, and all of a sudden kids wanted this or kids wanted that. And I think I probably treated about every possible thing, from toothaches to every type of wound. Made you feel like you were there for a purpose.
Like I'd have 15 Marines in one little village, and they would have their own compound in that village, at the end of it or at the start of it, somewhere there, and they would provide protection to the villagers, and at the same time assist them in their needs. They had a lot of wants, but we try to take care of their needs.
While the program showed real promise and some Marines thought that it might result in lasting progress, it was overwhelmed by larger events. In early 1968, near the Marine base at Khe Sanh, a severe test of the Leathernecks' skill and tenacity took place, which, along with the Tet Offensive, doomed the promising CAP program. In the face of the NVA buildup around Khe Sanh, the scattered CAP units were withdrawn and consolidated.
In 1967, and as 1968 begins, General Giap, in preparation for the Tet Offensive, wants to draw American forces away from the cities and into the outer or border areas of Vietnam. And the actions around Khe Sanh, the buildup of enemy forces in that area, is just one of the focal points that General Giap is using to draw the Americans out of the cities and prepare for the Tet Offensive.
The base at Khe Sanh was established in the summer of 1967. Seabees had carved out an airstrip while the Marines had dug trenches and built bunkers. Marine patrols moved throughout the area without making significant contact with the enemy. In late 1967, American reconnaissance efforts detected a North Vietnamese buildup around Khe Sanh. General Westmoreland made the decision to hold the outpost in hopes of drawing the North Vietnamese into open battle where American firepower could be applied.
Khe Sanh was an important outpost. If the enemy had taken this outpost, I think the province of Quang Tri and the DMZ area would have been in jeopardy. At the same time, he had planned to overrun Quang Tri City, seize and hold Hue, and to roll up our defenses south of the demilitarized zone.
The American plan at Khe Sanh was simple: to present the Vietnamese with a tempting bait by posting one American regiment of Marines out at the end of our line on the DMZ. When the Vietnamese responded with large units to try and overrun these Marines, we would smash them with our superior air power. The Vietnamese had a different plan. The Vietnamese plan, as perceived by many historians, was to draw the American attention out toward the borders of the country, while the main forces of the North Vietnamese and the National Liberation Front moved in to launch the Tet Offensive against the cities.
One of the most climactic and publicized battles of the Vietnam War would take place in a fog-shrouded remote mountain valley, just as had happened in 1954, when the Viet Minh, under General Giap, had surrounded and defeated French paratroops at Dien Bien Phu. The parallels were obvious and not lost on either side. Westmoreland's reinforcement of the base had set the stage by January 1968. Inside the 1 mile by 1/2 mile base, some 6,000 U.S. Marines, South Vietnamese Rangers, and support troops watched and waited. In the jungle-shrouded hills around the base, it was believed that over 20,000 North Vietnamese Army troops prepared to attack the outpost. On the 19th of January, a Marine reconnaissance patrol ran into serious enemy opposition and had to be rescued by the main Marine force. On the morning of the 21st, around 5 a.m., Khe Sanh came under intense enemy bombardment, and the outlying position was attacked by an enemy battalion. The siege of Khe Sanh was on in earnest. The base was struck over and over again by massive enemy artillery concentrations. American guns that had been well dug in fired back. Despite bad weather in the valley, American fighter bombers struck the hills surrounding the base with bombs, napalm, and rockets. Often these strikes were called on enemy positions less than 100 yards from the Marines' trenches. The NVA gunners endeavored to cut the base off from outside support. Weather was on their side, and any aircraft that made it through the anti-aircraft fire and onto the airstrip was immediately a target. By the 29th of January, U.S. commanders were predicting a major offensive against the base scheduled to coincide with the Lunar New Year, Tet. President Lyndon Johnson insisted all the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff sign a document guaranteeing that the base would not be overrun.
While the eyes of the American public and the administration were riveted on Khe Sanh, the blow actually fell on January 31st on the city of Hue, down in the lowlands. Hue had been the ancient imperial capital of Vietnam. It was overrun and occupied by a division of North Vietnamese troops after very little resistance.
After a prolonged and intense fight, Hue was finally secured by the Marines on February 24th, who suffered heavy casualties in the process. As the Tet Offensive died away, the focus of U.S. attention again shifted to Khe Sanh, whose garrison had continued to hold out against sustained enemy action. With the Tet Offensive over, direct ground attacks against the base had also tapered off. However, the incessant artillery fire had continued, and some days intensified. Any Marine effort to move beyond the perimeter was met with intense enemy fire. Because of the intense fire on the airstrip, resupply of the Marines had been reduced to airdrops and low-level pallet extraction. All the while, Air Force B-52s hammered at the surrounding jungle.
Was up in the north to see the B-52s bring in for the arc lighters. That's what we called them. Because at night it was awesome. They dropped that load and it would just light up the sky. That's where they got the name of the arc lighters.
In between B-52 raids, other aircraft took up the action.
Puff with the miniguns on. We'd call it on station. To see it work at night was something to behold. Every fifth round was a tracer, and looked like somebody was pouring actually molten lava out of the sky when that thing would fire up and go It was something else.
An average of 300 airstrikes dropped 5,000 bombs a day around Khe Sanh. By the end of the 77-day siege, more tons of bombs were dropped around Khe Sanh than were dropped on all of Japan during World War II. It seemed nothing could survive this bombardment. North Vietnamese sources, including newspapers and radio broadcasts, continued to predict the fall of Khe Sanh, comparing it to Dien Bien Phu. The American media also focused on the drama being played out in the Highland Valley. Concern grew at home over the fate of the Marines.
The Battle of Khe Sanh. This was a very traumatic experience for the American people, but I never had any real concern about Khe Sanh. I had a few restless nights, but I had full confidence that we were going to win the Battle of Khe Sanh because we had the means.
With virtually around-the-clock air support from all the services and the successful aerial resupply of the base by the U.S. Air Force, Khe Sanh theoretically was never in the same peril as the French at Dien Bien Phu. The Marines were never completely cut off from outside support. Also, unlike the French, there were other U.S. bases close enough to support the Marines. The garrison itself had a variety of heavy weapons with which to defend themselves and hunkered down while air power unmercifully pounded the North Vietnamese surrounding the base. Life for the Marines on the base settled into a routine of sorts, and the regular activities of men in war were carried out: weapons cleaning, recreation, mail, and eating. But during most of the siege, these activities had to be carried out underground. Overhead, the jets screamed on, and the rockets and artillery shells from the north continued to slam into the base. By late March, the enemy pressure slackened considerably, and and on April 7th, a 30,000-man joint operation spearheaded by the Army's 1st Air Cavalry Division reopened the road to the beleaguered base. It ran into only token opposition along the way. The siege was over.
The aftermath of the Battle of Khe Sanh is one of those rare occasions in warfare where both sides claim victory and with some justification. On one hand, General Giap clearly can say that he successfully drew American forces away from the cities in preparation for the Tet Offensive. On the other hand, General Westmoreland can claim that he was successful in drawing the Vietnamese into a set-piece battle in the area of Khe Sanh and inflicting heavy casualties on those forces, thereby reducing the numbers of people that are available to General Giap for the Tet Offensive. And so you have this rare occasion in war when both sides say, we were successful, and they're right.
On May 23, 1968, the 26th Marine Regiment was cited by President Johnson for the defense of Khe Sanh.
Some have asked what the gallantry of these Marines and airmen accomplished. Why did we choose to pay the price to defend those dreary hills? The fortress at Khe Sanh straddled critical supply and infiltration routes that the North Vietnamese were using. Route 9, which it commanded, was to be a major avenue for the enemy into populated areas and into the cities of South Vietnam. By pinning down and by decimating 2 North Vietnamese divisions, the few thousand Marines and their gallant South Vietnamese allies prevented those divisions from entering other major battles, such as those for Hue and Quang Tri. I believe that our initiative toward talks with North Vietnam was greatly strengthened by what these men did at Khe Sanh.
When the Battle of Khe Sanh ended and the siege was lifted, the American command had an official body count of North Vietnamese killed that stood at 1,600. It was estimated that a further 15,000 had been killed, but the bodies, of course, had not been found. What is known for sure, there had been 1,200 Marine casualties defending the base. The base was soon abandoned, and the question remains, was it worthwhile? What had really happened around the Khe Sanh base? To this day, no one is sure.
During the next 2 years, the Marines were slowly withdrawn from the fighting and ultimately from the country. They turned the hard-fought countryside and bases over to the forces of South Vietnam as part of the Vietnamization process.
Nixon declared the Vietnamization program, started drawing the troops out of American troops out of Vietnam. The unit that I was in had been in Vietnam since very early on, in 1965, so they were one of the first units to be pulled out. And people with less than 6 months in country and those that volunteered stayed in country.
As soon as you got assigned to a unit, you were pretty much informed that the situation was that we weren't taking casualties anymore if we could avoid it. And I think that's why the withdrawal came about.
For the Marines who fought in Vietnam, there is no doubt of the impact of the war on their lives.
It's hard to be a commander and make decisions that can cost people's lives, but unfortunately, you have no choice. It's just, and it's hard to live with it sometimes afterwards.
I did not enjoy the outcome of the Vietnam War. It was not, I still, after nearly 25 years, it has been not a really exciting thing to look back and say I served in a war that we never were allowed to win.
It hurts when you lose people. But I think what even hurts more is when you lose people when you know that if someone had allowed you to do what you could do, you might not have lost them. Hurts even more.
When I got out, I came home, went to college, and people had no it was real hard to talk to anyone because they didn't have much concept of where I'd been, what was going on, and it was real hard. I didn't talk to anybody about it for years.
I was admitted to a junior college, which meant that I needed to get out 2 months early. And unfortunately, my commanding general was short of troops and wasn't letting anybody go. So it came down to getting my congressman to write him a letter and demand that he turn me loose. And I'd pretty much given up on it. I was going out on patrol one morning, and a guy came up to me and said, "Pack your bags, you're leaving in the morning. You're out of here." And from that time, I think it was 48 hours, and I was on a college campus. And it was just, no decompression whatsoever.
Vietnam's something I'll never forget. It will live with me for the rest of my life. I think about it every day. It's not a day go by I don't think about it. Something will come about. Could be the way the wind's blowing, the way the rain's falling, some smells. It'll pop right in my head.
I've come to accept what it was really about. I've accepted my role there. It's not important to me anymore to believe that there had to be a good reason for what happened, had to be a good reason for all the people that died. And it's like a weight off your shoulders. One thing that was a really positive experience about Vietnam was the camaraderie that I haven't experienced any time since.
There's an old saying, what's Marine, always Marine, that's true.